This video is sponsored by Skillshare. The first 1,000 people who click the link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium. The success of last year's entry into Microsoft's Flight Simulator series is simultaneously easy to understand and kind of wild when you really think about it. The genius decision to put a full, traversable model of planet Earth on Game Pass at a time when international travel is categorically a no-no pretty much guaranteed the game access to a massive mainstream audience. On the other hand, the amount of stories I've heard from people I know bouncing off of this game almost immediately has been similarly understandable, given that even past the gargantuan install times and crazy high system requirements acting as their own barriers to entry, essentially what we have here are people trying to cure their isolation-induced wanderlust by diving into full-blown pilot training. See, I feel like more so than other games of this type, Flight Simulator is robust in its simulation, and its presentation is appropriately stark. It shows these planes to be exactly what they are, tools of pure function. It's not really a game per se, it's not to be toyed with. It coldly presents you with the stupidly complicated task at hand of getting these heaps of metal off of the ground and lugging them across the planet, and requires a lot of focus on the absolute minutiae of these machines while you do so. And even if you alleviate all of that by turning all the assists on, you still find that traversing a one-to-one simulation of a planet made of 75% water is going to feature a lot of staring at, well, ocean and clouds, albeit exceedingly pretty ones, for vast chunks of time. Don't get me wrong here, I loved the many hours I put into Flight Simulator, just as I've loved playing other simulators. I find their relative mundanity pretty relaxing. That said, it was hard not to feel a little deflated that such a huge recreation of Earth, one of the game's main selling points, especially during the ongoing situation, consistently felt out of reach somehow. Clearly this isn't the game's fault. You know, interaction with the world outside isn't the focus here. If you were meant to view this environment at all from the boxy confines of your cockpit, you were meant to view it from thousands of feet up. This landscape, with its accurately mapped roads and buildings dotted around, is all supposed to grant an extra layer of believability, to immerse you more fully in the function you are performing. That's it. If you want to actually explore the planet, surely something like Google Earth VR is probably a better bet. Flight Sim is about flying planes specifically, right? Well, so I thought. As it turns out, your view of this world is not necessarily limited to your cockpit. Flight Sim being the technical marvel that it is, the developers clearly wanted to show off the GPU-crushing beauty of the world they generated, the utterly gorgeous cloud and weather systems they could so realistically generate, and so they made the extremely wise decision to include a photo mode of sorts, with the exterior or drone functionality allowing players complete control in framing that gorgeous sunset or flying over a famous landmark. For me though, it opened up many more possibilities, ones that ended up taking me to some pretty wild and, dare I say, magical places, both literally and in a more abstract sense, that I'm absolutely sure I wasn't meant to see. And yet, this strange journey I ended up going on completely opened up how I viewed Flight Sim as a game, or as we'll come on to, games. It came to deepen my appreciation of its technical majesty, as well as getting me to examine more broadly how we approach this medium along the way. Now, I realise that's a hell of a lot to attribute to one camera mode, so let me try and break it down for you. After getting my plane off the ground for the billionth time and realising that no matter how hard I try to convince myself otherwise, I'm never going to have the time or energy to make that several-hour transatlantic flight, I descended into my usual pattern with these games, trying to do the sickest flips imaginable, messing with the boundaries of the simulation for purely comedic effect. And it was actually upon trying to find a means of jetting myself back into the air when I found the aforementioned drone mode, clicking on every option I could find while my 747 lay upside down amongst a bunch of remarkably sturdy houses, altitude alarms beeping away incessantly. And it was a surprisingly revelatory moment, that click when I realised I was no longer tethered to my recently flipped jetliner, and that suddenly I now had a completely different perspective with which to explore that world. that going into Flight Sim I was so curious about. I could get up close to it, touch it. My prior disappointment was now replaced with pure potential, as it became clear I was now taking a stroll through the world beneath Flight Simulator's clouds rather than soaring above them. It's not a completely natural process, to be clear. You still have to do a little work to buy into the illusion, as it were. You're not so much taking steps as you are floating along, and you have to get a bit fiddly with the buttons when you come across any kind of elevation to maintain the height of your camera, lest you find yourself face planting through the sun-kissed grass. Also, given how system-intensive rendering all this stuff happens to be, it became clear early on that getting up close to this stuff wasn't going to be the smoothest gaming experience out there. But once I'd gotten a handle on the separate control scheme of this mode and dialed in the speed settings, I tended to find around 5 to 10% was the sweet spot. For all intents and purposes, I turned Flight Simulator into a walking sim. And honestly, the first thing that jumped out at me as I wandered away from my plane, unsure of where I'd crashed or how to get to anywhere I actually recognised, was the still evident beauty of it all. Climbing the nearest hill, wandering across this lush green landscape that, thanks to the gorgeous sunset, simultaneously possessed a kind of dry, arid quality, I was thrown right back to navigating the plains of Red Dead in first person. For sure, it wasn't a particularly accurate depiction of my actual location, but that didn't stop that wave of legitimate awe washing over me as I looked out onto this vast distance that was suddenly all out there to discover. I was dwarfed by this environment. I felt small. It was exciting to think that the chances that someone else had done all of this, gone to the same weirdo lengths that I had done to create some kind of illusion of walking, and had journeyed to this particular spot with this view, this alignment of clouds, and this particular shade of sun shining through them, were so low as to be practically non-existent. I might have been the only person to see this place exactly like this. There's something kind of existentially terrifying about that, in a No Man's Sky, you're just a speck in an endless universe kind of way, but it's also really special. I don't know, I always found something quite comforting about finding a little piece of nature on the long walks I would go on pre-pandemic, and just embracing the quiet of it all. It was a big part of helping me clear my head, while also reminding me that, it hasn't all been found or seen yet. There's a whole world out there that's bigger than just you. And I was pretty shocked to find that Flight Sim was now capturing that kind of meditative, exploratory impulse in a way that simply wasn't the case when I was just pursuing the loose objective of flying between two predetermined points on the globe. Simply by changing the perspective, the way I was interacting with this world, the game was resonating with me on a completely different and arguably much deeper level. It also became very apparent that this environment didn't work exactly as you'd expect. See, there's every chance that empty vista I was looking out on was supposed to be some kind of town or factory or city that the game just hadn't rendered properly. The systems do their best to represent things as accurately as possible from that bird's eye view, but once you're on the ground, you start to see the workarounds, the tape trying desperately and a lot of times failing to hold all of this together. Elevation is a pretty key issue, with the software often unsure how to parse the map data it's being fed, how tall its buildings should be, what even constitutes a building versus what doesn't, etc. For example, the developers went above and beyond in modelling almost every airport on the planet as a point of departure, but just stepping off the runway of even the more detailed ones was when I started to see just how odd and eerie this world was. And looking back now, it's clear that this is where my true journey with Flight Simulator had really begun. And I will tell you all about it right after I quickly tell you about today's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community for creative and curious people. Explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity with Skillshare's inspiring online classes on topics including illustration, photography, video design, and more. We're going to be looking at some pretty wild environments today, but have you ever considered creating your own? Why not begin with a class like 3D illustration, creating isometric designs in Adobe Illustrator by DKNG Studios, showing you how to use basic tools of the software to design and illustrate these cool, detailed environments in what the duo describe as the SimCity style. What's more, Skillshare offers classes designed for real life and all the circumstances that come with it. These lessons can help you to stay inspired, express yourself, and introduce you to a community of millions, all for less than $10 a month with an annual subscription. And because Skillshare is sponsoring this video, the first 1,000 people who click my link in the description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium, so there's no risk to checking it out for yourself, and you'll really be helping out the channel in the process. Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video, and now back to the shift in perspective that started me on my weird and beautiful journey with Flight Simulator. Walking along the flat roads leading away from these airports, trees had started to grow in places where there were no trees, an anomaly that speaks to the software's insistence that anywhere it can't detect or produce a building, it instantly attempts to turn into greenery or dense forest. That said, combined with the distinct lack of people at these normally busy airports, this kind of foliage system started to give off the vibe of nature creeping back against humanity, like some kind of cataclysmic, post-apocalyptic event has taken place. But it also wasn't as coherent as that. Walking a bit further, I realised that while there might not be people in this world per se, there certainly are cars. Little incomplete chassis that barely connect with their wheels, seemingly floating along the ground like I was. These wee things are everywhere, racing with reckless abandon into and through each other, running into dead ends only to immediately snap around and go back the way they came on an infinite loop. It was neat to follow these things around, to see how the game was defining a road, but it also just painted this world as one ruled by toy cars. More disturbing though was following them as they would suddenly ascend these massive, almost sheer protrusions that would just be there in the road, the concrete comprising it apparently long cracked and broken and flung around by some kind of earthquake. Of course, in reality, it's just another error in the data, a computational earthquake if you will. In the other direction, cars would be absorbed by the huge buildings that now inexplicably stood blocking the entire motorway, ready to consume anything that came close. Following these roads to the nearest village, I guess, I came across a wealth of houses that couldn't be entered. I don't just mean there was nothing inside, you can clearly clip through them. I mean that their doors were buried under several feet of dirt, much of which was blotched red for some worrying reason. Many of the houses have 2 front doors, and as is to be expected, cars just plough right through them. I'd see 2 homes intersect with one another, and I'd think, if I open this door, whose house am I actually entering here? What parked cars weren't flattened, encased under the ground, had become melded into the landscape itself, as much a part of nature as the trees and grass and rocks awkwardly jutting out from whichever points the game decided it needed to fill up. And while for many people their interaction with the world below involved crashing into their pal's street, I was interested in actually walking around those streets, seeing how the game would represent those places I was familiar with, the areas I would find a great deal of comfort in. What I found though was surprisingly unsettling. I could recognise it, but I also couldn't. What I knew to be a bustling village with varied, vibrant storefronts was now devoid of life entirely. I imagined I was hacking my way through this newly formed dense jungle brush to get to these completely uniform suburban houses, half buried as all residential areas in this game seem to be. The entrance to the supermarket I used to work at, with its usually bright, welcoming entrance, was now a dot on a barren wasteland. An ominous wall of tightly packed homes standing before a giant block. The shopping centre I trudged to every day, the fast food place where I scrubbed the floors, all of it in the vague shape of places I knew and hated so well, but their actual structures unrecognisable. They had become amorphous, losing any identifiable branding or iconography, but they'd also become more overtly industrial in a way that felt weirdly honest. As nature had so consumed these streets I'd previously walked along, these buildings had lost all facade of humanity, now representing more purely the cold, factory-esque monuments of consumerism that they kind of always were underneath it all. They were now as much tools of function as the planes I had long since abandoned. And you know, what does that make me? At this stage, that feeling of being a speck in an infinite, uncaring universe was becoming more and more difficult to avoid. And it was a similar story in every city I visited, even the bigger ones that had been afforded the photogrammetry treatment. That is to say, had their data pulled from Bing Maps in order to render them more realistically in-game. Even these places were like Lego sets blown up to incomprehensible scale. The windows and doors on these office blocks and skyscrapers were completely warped, like someone had draped a building tarpaulin on these nondescript cuboids. Cities were melting before my eyes. Streets you'd normally be able to walk down uninterrupted were now these inhospitable clusters of distorted pavements and overbearing plant life that only these wee cars would be able to navigate. I was often greeted by fortress-like walls and imagined the remnants of civilization hunkered down behind them, blocking out some unknown and unwanted force. Certain residential districts, generally in poorer areas, would have tiny houses so densely packed together that the game wouldn't even recognize them as houses anymore. Climbing over them brought to mind coastal rock formations I'd jump along at the beach as a kid, way more so than it did people's homes. And it did get me asking questions, like how exactly was it determined which cities or airports or districts were more important to be fully detailed versus ones that weren't? Obviously this is just one team, they couldn't possibly recreate every single place in pristine detail, but there are plenty of massive population centres that in-game stand as these unrecognisable husks, places you would never get the impression up close that anyone actually lived in. And to be clear, I don't think this is representative of any conscious bias on the part of the developers, mainly because the software is so full of oddities that would appear to go against that notion. Like this oddly Soviet-looking block of flats, for example, it's actually Buckingham Palace. Westminster Bridge, usually heaving with tourists you have to barge through to cross, is totally submerged. A fact that stopped precisely 0 cars as they raced to get to Big Ben, now accustomed to their new commute through the Thames. The Shard appears as delicately crafted origami, impossible angles folding in on themselves and making me imagine the people inside controlling the world's finances while constantly leaning over just a little. And after exploring all of this, or as much as as one person could, there was only really one more place to go. Messing with nature itself. Flinging myself totally into chaos and maxing out every one of the game's weather sliders turned what is usually a hugely impressive live recreation of exactly the conditions of any given place at any given time into complete oblivion. I was now living through the natural disasters that might have led to this world becoming as uncanny and empty as it ended up. And unexpectedly, it led to perhaps some of the most memorable stories I lived out in Flight Simulator. I watched as hurricane-force winds tore through the Statue of Liberty. I found myself instinctually seeking some kind of shelter from an intense snowstorm in the middle of France, using only the glow of house lights to guide me through the pitch black of night. And as someone who is irrationally anxious about things like getting lost in the void of space, I probably should have thought twice before throwing myself into the middle of the Sahara. What can I say, I was curious as to how the game would handle it, with the PS1 looking texture at my feet extending endlessly into the distance, giving me a great deal of urgency in finding something, anything to make me feel less alone. And the relief I felt upon coming across a single house was intense, regardless of whether I could enter it or not, if it were actually there in real life or merely another glitch in the system. And this entire experience came to a head when, while similarly messing with the weather settings like a complete dingus, I misclicked and immediately panicked as I hurtled away from land, while the game, like a stern parent, looked at me and said enough's enough while trying to put me back in control of my plane. I was lost at sea, feeling completely powerless, frantically seeking some means of hitting undo while bearing witness to the humbling power of Mother Nature, the formerly gorgeous clouds now blood red, evoking sheer terror as they closed in on me and I looked for any way to escape this insane storm I'd just created. In some ways, I felt a little more comfortable in the plane. At least then I wasn't just that one speck in the middle of it all. And at this point, I was totally shocked. This world had showed me that it was too big, too complex, and too uncaring for one person to truly grasp. And what's important here is that my prior joke about turning Flight Sim into a walking sim is actually not so much of a joke. It goes beyond just changing the control method or camera perspective, and instead is more about the kind of experience I would go on to have with it. The genuine curiosity this shift in perspective brought out in me was similar to that of something like The Witness, where that game's reticence to explain much about the workings of its setting ends up playing into the mystery and compelling me to dive further and further in, completely unsure of where it would take me. The relaxing layout of cushions and a drink in this sunny, quiet and empty world suggests that there were people here recently, but where did they go? What happened to them? I recognise these kinds of structures and biomes, but not necessarily in this proximity to each other. What's the deal with that? You know, just because Flight Simulator was absolutely not designed to be this kind of game, just because this stuff wasn't meant to be viewed this close or thought about in this way, doesn't mean that I didn't have a legitimately great, meaningful time doing so. Let me tell you a story real quick. Late last year, a tweet started making the rounds about a virtual house tour for a seemingly quaint little place at 8800 Blue Lick Road in Louisville, Kentucky. Judging from the outside and the description talking about its versatility, being used as everything from a school to a church, it's as outwardly wholesome as you can imagine. Inside is, well, another story entirely, where this innocuous virtual tour takes a turn for something wholly confusing, occasionally horrifying, and crucially, interactive. Indeed, once I hit enter and saw the absolute hellscape that is this property's living room, which, need I remind you, is the opening salvo of what is ultimately a sales pitch, there was nothing stopping me leaving this house by simply closing the browser tab. But in my poking and prodding around this bomb site, my eye was caught by the little crumpled Minions doormat just down the stairs. Well, that's funny, I've got to see what that's about, right? And that's when they had me. The horrifying descent into this labyrinth had only just begun, as well as the cavalcade of new questions I found myself asking with every step I took. Just how could someone live like this? Was this someone or someone's? The bedrooms, with their cabinets and shelves awkwardly jutting out in exactly the same way as the living room, look more like claustrophobic prison cells than anywhere you could actually feel comfortable. And the chilling thing is, you get the feeling people are still actually living here. There's discs everywhere, and outdated technology with which to watch and copy them? Wait a minute, what's all this? Piles of boxes forming their own maze of corridors. These DVD covers don't seem real. What's with the weird incoherent merchandise here? Wait, the urinals have carpet underneath them. The women's bathroom is just two toilets sitting next to each other with no dividing wall. What the fuck happened here? How is this house so cursed? Is this the cat's doing? At this point I realise I've been navigating this maze for literally half an hour, with every corner turned bringing with it further confusion as to what the story is here. Finally, completely by chance and tucked away in the furthest corner of this former school's massive basement floor, I stumble across the bathtub room, replete with Subway drink cup for some reason. After all that, I guess I'd seen all there was to see. I had found what the author of the initial tweet put forward as the objective of sorts. Again, I could close the browser at any point and walk away, and yet it didn't stop me from turning around and having that spine-tingling feeling, even for just a second, that I was so deep into this winding maze that I had no idea how to navigate my way back from here. I was lost, trapped, alone, I'd hope. I am not kidding when I say I had an absolute blast with this thing. I was so invested in this weird developing narrative formed entirely of my own questions based on how I was discovering these items, in what order, etc., that it took me a second to jolt back to reality. This experience had all the genuine intrigue and player-driven mystery solving, the uncomfortable voyeurism, and dare I say, creeping horror of games like Her Story and Gone Home, all topped off with the completely absurd comedy of the fact that none of this was even remotely intended. This was supposed to be a purely functional house tour, and yet it legitimately stuck with not only me, but many others who took it upon themselves to delve further into the mystery, uncovering some truly wild revelations. Hell, there's people who speedrun finding the bathtub. At this point, 8800 Blue Lick Road is no longer just a house tour. It's a layered, meaningful, interactive story in its own right. It is a video game. And I guess my point with this is that as much as I understand how odd it might seem that I felt so compelled to play Flight Simulator like this, that I took so much enjoyment from this kind of subversion of intended play, this is not some unprecedented phenomenon. Finding the game within the game, as it were, exists everywhere in this medium. I've explored it in games like Star Citizen, where my fight against relentless bugs and glitches turned the infinity of space into a Sisyphean commute, or finding beauty in the absurdity of a game like Snaky Buzz, or examining how the ways in which Ghost Recon Wildlands was broken ended up making me feel like much more of a lone, exhausted soldier than its intended systems could ever have allowed for. More broadly, you see it at events like Awesome Games Done Quick, where speedrunners have taken Doom, one of the most acclaimed first-person shooters in years, and proceed to tear it to shreds. A lot of people think of it purely in terms of geometry and skips. They label it absurdly broken, and yet they still have an incredibly worthwhile experience with the game that they, in part, found. It follows its own narrative of sorts, of people banging their heads against the wall, fairly literally in some cases, and eventually triumphing where few people ever will. The software of Doom, with the wealth of time and skill and knowledge that went into it, still brought joy and satisfaction to people, even if the game of navigating that software is distinct from the actual game of Doom itself. But I think it's slightly different in Flight Simulator's case. I get the feeling that a lot of people are going to say that this piece is unfair in some way to the game, but believe me, I do not hold any of what I've talked about here against the game as any kind of negative. None of this is to suggest that Flight Simulator is anything other than a technical masterwork on almost every level. Its planes are absurdly detailed in exactly the way you'd expect, its lighting is unbelievable, the clouds are industry leading as far as I'm concerned. Hell, just the fact that they created this thing, mapped out an entire world for you to fly around, is completely nuts. Flight Simulator played as intended is fantastic. This other side of Flight Sim is just that, an extra layer of this experience that I happen to have a different kind of fun with. Hell, it was able to make me contemplate my place in the universe while exploring a new version of that universe. And there's one thing that worries me about all of this. In the days following the game's release, you heard all these stories about the massive thing poking out the ground in Melbourne, and various other irregularities that were funny as hell, and often amounted to mere typos that sent the elevation data spiraling out of control. And I can imagine some anxiety on the part of the developers to correct and erase some of those irregularities. They go against the vision of creating a 100% believable planet, and in a world where post-launch support is so ubiquitous in games, where every title is a platform to be constantly built upon and made better, you can already see things like update packs that serve to bring more detail to airports and cities, to make them appear more realistic. The developers have talked about a continuous process of finding these bugs and fixing them. Flight Simulator, by all accounts, isn't finished yet, it's ongoing. And I don't know, I completely understand that impulse, but there is that worry that with enough polish and technological advancements, that weird separate game I stumbled upon within Flight Simulator might one day not exist, at least not in the way that I experienced it. I believe that there's real value in preserving some form of games at whatever stage they're at, blemishes and all, because presenting your game as pristinely as possible is one thing, but when the imperfections bring with them such comedy, horror, mystery, and introspection, I'll take that version of the game any day of the week. If this journey has shown me anything, it's that software doesn't simply have to contain the one intended experience, and if you can find that game within the game in whatever you're playing, then be sure to embrace it while it's still around. That experience is yours, and it is special. So yeah, thanks for sticking around. If you liked the video, you can really help the channel by clicking the corresponding button as well as subscribing. I'm also going to be streaming a lot more in the near future, so be sure to follow me at twitch.tv/writingongames to be updated on when I'm going live. The streams so far have been a lot of fun. And check out my podcast in the description too. I'd also like to thank my patrons here. These videos, especially longer ones like this, simply would not be possible without your support, and I really do mean that. If you've enjoyed any of the videos I've put out and want to help the channel continue so I can keep making more, you can directly help out as well as get things like early access to ad-free video uploads by heading to patreon.com/writingongames and pledging only what you feel comfortable with. I am forever thankful for your support in whatever form it takes. Special thanks go to Mark B. Writing, Artyom Vitsyuk, Nicholas Villeneuve, Captain Knuspich, Ruth Knapman, Leah Chinello, Henry Mielek, Bryce Snyder, Lucas, David Björk, Winter, Timothy Jones, Jordan Midler, Hebe Amori, The Nameless Guy, Tommy Carver Chaplin, Dr. Motorcycle, Michael, Shardfire, Rob, Anna Pimentel, Jesse Ryan, Spike Jones, Dallas Keane, Charlie Kimball, and Charlie Yang. And with that, this has been another episode of Writing on Games. Thank you all so much for watching, stay safe, and I will see you all next time.